Although originally I presumed that the differences between these worlds was caused entirely by the subjectivity of the various human viewpoints, it did not take me long to open the question as to whether it might not be more than that in fact plural realities did exist superimposed onto one another like so many film transparencies. What I still do not grasp, however, is how one reality out of the many becomes actualized in contradistinction to the others. Perhaps none does, or perhaps again it hangs on an agreement in viewpoint by a sufficiency of people. More likely the matrix world, the one with the true core of being, is determined by the programmer. He or it articulates, prints out, so to speak, the matrix choice and fuses it with actual substance. The core or essence of reality, that which receives or attains it, and to what degree, that is within the purview of the programmer. This selection and reselection is part of general creativity, of world building, which seems to be it or his task. A problem, perhaps, which he or it is running, which is to say, in the process of solving, as a computer would. Variables along the linear time axis of our universe, thereby generating branched-off lateral worlds. I have the impression that the metaphor of the chessboard is especially useful in evaluating how this can be done. In fact, must be. Across from the programmer-reprogrammer sits a counter-entity, whom Joseph Campbell calls the dark counterplayer. God, the programmer-reprogrammer, is not making his moves of improvement against inert matter. He is dealing with a cunning opponent. Let us say that on the game board, our universe in space-time, the dark counterplayer makes a move. He sets up a reality situation of immutable cause and effect. But the programmer-reprogrammer has already laid down his response. It has already happened, these moves on his part. The printout, which we undergo as historic events, passes through stages of a dialectical interaction, thesis and antithesis, as the forces of the two players mingle. Evidently, some syntheses fall to the dark counterplayer, and yet they do not, by virtue of the fact that in advance our great advocate selected variables, the alternation of which brings final victory to him. In winning each sequence in turn, he claims some of us, we who participate in the sequence. This is why instinctively people pray, Libera me Domine, which decodes to mean, extricate me, programmer, as you achieve one victory after another. Include me in that triumph. Move me along the lateral axis so that I am not left out. Sense as being left out means nothing other than remaining under the jurisdiction of or falling prey to the malignant power. But that malignant power, for all its guile, has already lost even as it wins. For in some way the counterplayer is blind, and so the programmer-reprogrammer possesses an advantage. I submit to you that such alterations, the creation or selection of such so-called alternative presence, is continually taking place. The very fact that we can conceptually deal with this notion, that is, entertain it as an idea, is a first step in discerning such processes themselves. But I doubt if we will ever be able in any real fashion to demonstrate, to scientifically prove that such lateral change processes do occur. Probably all we would have to go on would be vestiges of memory, fleeting impressions, dreams, nebulous intuitions that somehow things had been different in some way, and not long ago, but now. We might reflexively reach for a light switch in the bathroom only to discover that it always had been, in another place entirely. We might reach for the air vent in our car where there was no air vent, a reflex left over from a previous present, still active at a subcortical level. We might dream of people and places we had never seen as vividly as if we had seen them and actually known them. but we would not know what to make of this, assuming we took time to ponder it at all.
Nous chercherions de la...
One very pronounced impression would probably occur to us, to many of us, again and again, and always without explanation, the acute, absolute sensation that we had done once before what we were just about to do now, that we, so to speak, lived in a particular moment or situation previously. But in what sense could it be called previously, since only the present, not the past, was evidently involved? We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off, became actualized instead of the prior one, and that in fact, in literal fact, we are once more living this particular segment of linear time. A breaching, a tinkering, a change had been made, but not in our present, had been made in our past. Evidently, such an alteration would have a peculiar effect on those persons involved. They would, so to speak, be moved back one square or several squares on the board game which constitutes our reality. Conceivably, this could happen any number of times, affecting any number of people, as alternative variables were reprogrammed. We would have to live out each reprogramming along the subsequent linear time axis, but to the programmer, whom we call God, to him the results of the programming would be apparent at once. We are within time, and he is not. I wish to ad lib. We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. This, too, might account for the sensation people get of having lived past lives. They may well have, but not in the past. Previous lives, rather, in the present, in perhaps an unending repeated and repeated present, like a great clock dial in which grand clock hands sweep out the same circumference forever, with all of us carried along unknowingly, yet dimly suspecting. Since at the resolution of every encounter of thesis and antithesis between the dark counterplayer and the divine programmer, a new synthesis is struck off, and since it is possible that each time this happens a lateral world may be generated, and since I conceive that each synthesis or resolution is to some degree a victory by the programmer, each struck-off world in sequence must be an improvement upon not just the prior one, but an improvement upon all the latent or merely possible outcomes. It is a better world, but in no sense perfect, which is to say final. It is merely an improved stage within a process. What I envision clearly is that the programmer is perpetually using the antecedent universe as a gigantic stockpile for each new synthesis, the antecedent universe then possessing the aspect of chaos or anomie in relation to an emerging new cosmos. Therefore, the endless process of sequential struck-off alternate worlds emerging and being infused with actualization is negentropic in some way that we cannot see. What we need at this point is to locate, to bring forth as evidence, someone who has managed somehow, it doesn't matter how, to retain memories of a different present, latent alternate world impressions, different in some significant way from this, the one which is at this stage actualized. According to my theoretical view, it would almost certainly be memories of a worse world than this. For it is not reasonable that God the programmer and reprogrammer would substitute a worse world in terms of freedom or beauty or love or order or healthiness by any standard which we know. When a mechanic works on your malfunctioning car, he does not damage it further. When a writer creates a second draft of a novel, he does not debase it further, but strives to improve it. I suppose it could be argued in a strictly theoretical way that God might be evil or insane and would in fact substitute a worse world for a better one. but frankly, I cannot take that idea seriously. Let us pass that over. So let us ask, does any one of us remember in any dim fashion a worse Earth circa 1977 than this? Have our young men seen visions and our old men dreamed dreams? Nightmare dreams specifically about a world of enslavement and evil, of prisons and jailers and ubiquitous police? I have. I wrote out these dreams in novel after novel, story after story. To name two in which this prior ugly present obtained most clearly, I cite The Man in the High Castle and my 1974 novel about the U.S. as a police state, called Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said. I'm going to be very candid with you. I wrote both novels based on fragmentary residual memories of such a horrid slave state world. Or perhaps the term world is the wrong one, and I should say United States, since in both novels I was writing about my own country. I can even tell you what caused me to remember. In late February of 1974, I was given sodium pentothal for the extraction of impacted wisdom teeth. Later that day, back home again, but still deeply under the influence of the sodium pentothal, I had a short, acute flash of recovered memory. In one instant, I caught it all, but immediately rejected it. Rejected it, however, with the realization that what I had retrieved in the way of varied memories was authentic. Then, in mid-March, a month later, the total body of memories, intact and entire, began to return. You are free to believe me or to disbelieve, but please take my word on it that I am not joking. This is very serious, a matter of importance. I am sure that at the very least you will agree that for me, even to claim this is in itself amazing. People claim to remember past lives. I claim to remember a different, very different present life. I know of no one who has ever made this claim before, but I rather suspect that my experience is not unique. What perhaps is unique is the fact that I am willing to talk about it. If you have followed me this far, I would like you to be kind enough to go a little further with me. I would like to share with you something I knew that is retrieved along with the blocked off memories. In March of 1974, the reprogrammed variables tinkered with back at some earlier date, probably in the late 40s. In March of 1974, the payoff, the results, of at least one and possibly more of the reprogrammed variables lying along the linear timeline of our past set in. What happened between March and August of 1974 was the result of at least one reprogrammed variable laid down perhaps 30 years before, setting into motion a thread of change which culminated in what I am sure you will admit was a spectacularly important and unique historical event, the forced removal from office of a President of the United States, Richard Nixon, as well as all those associated with him. In the alternative world which I remembered, the civil rights movements, the anti-war movements of the 60s had failed, and evidently, in the mid-70s, Nixon was not removed from power. That which deposed him, if anything indeed existed that did oppose him or could oppose him, was inadequate. Therefore, one or more factors tending toward that destruction of the entrenched tyrannical power had retroactively to us come to be introduced. The scales, 30 years later, in it had been 2,000 years ago at its inception. It was regarded as subversive and revolutionary, and let me add, this appraisal by the police authorities was correct. It took me almost 2 weeks after the return of my memories of my life in Track A to rid myself of the overpowering impression that all references to Christ, all sacerdotal acts, had to be veiled in absolute secrecy. But historically, this fits the pattern of a fascist takeover, especially those along Nazi lines. I would like to read something which I had deleted. So, yes, sir.